This is the Legacy of the Industrial Revolution Objective 2 about the legacies of the Industrial Revolution in the South. Now, in the previous objective, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and how it affects America, well, most people would directly point to the Northeast. They would take a look at the Rust Belt today and all the major industries that came out from there. Truth be told, yeah, Rockefeller was from the Cleveland area and did most of his work there. Carnegie was from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. Vanderbilt built his railroads primarily around the New York area, and even J.P. Morgan tried to get the Niagara contract and actually did most of his work in the Northeast as well. So it's pretty easy to take a look at the Industrial Revolution in America as a strictly Northeastern American thing. But the revolution actually hit a couple other parts, the South and the West. However, the influence in the South was a little bit different if you think about it. If the Industrial Revolution was a tidal wave in the North, it was barely a ripple in the South. By 1900, the South was producing even less of the nation's industry than it had even before the Civil War, if that tells you anything, as people left the region to go get jobs in the North. Now, by 1900, the South was still hanging on to some of its older traditions. At that time, by 1900, the South was still full of sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and abandoned plantations. Now, this is, again, the turn of the century, 1900, roughly 40 years or 35 years after the end of the Civil War, and we still had abandoned plantations sitting around in different places. We also still had the sharecroppers. Now, remember, sharecroppers were those that shared the crop with the landowners. The owner would help pay for the materials and the supplies and the seed and everything like that, but the sharecroppers in turn would have to give them a pretty good chunk of the crop to make it worth their time. That's why they called it sharecropping. Tenant farmers, on the other hand, got the money for the crop. They basically took care of themselves for the most part, but there were so many production costs involved with that that it wasn't necessarily beneficial either. They had to pay, after they got the crop, they had to pay the landlord, the owner of the land, for the land, and then they had to pay for supplies that they got themselves. In the end, when it's all said and done, whether you're a sharecropper who is just flat out sharing the crop with the owner of the land, or you're renting the land for yourself and paying for your own supplies, the farmer really ends up with very little. Most of it is going to go to someone else. In sharecropping, you're giving most of the profit to the guy who owns your land that you're sharing the crop with. And if you're a tenant farmer, you're paying rent on the land and for all the supplies. Again, ultimately, you really don't end up with a whole lot. Now, what about cotton? Now, cotton had once been known as King Cotton in the South. It had dominated Southern agriculture really from 1800 all the way up to the Civil War. With the free labor from the slaves and everything like that, cotton yields were absolutely massive. Well, after the Civil War, King Cotton really was not as influential as it had been, but it was still important. It kind of pales in comparison to the way it dominated the South before the Civil War, and frankly, cotton producers had dominated American politics. But after the Civil War, as you can imagine, with the labor force gone, and now your labor is coming from poor whites and newly freed slaves as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, the influence of King Cotton declined, but it was still very vital and very important to the country. The invention of the cigarette was something that actually became a little more prominent and boosted the Southern economy after the Civil War. The cigarette, which became known as the coffin nail to a lot of people because smoking too many of them could kill you, in the 1880s is when it was invented. The invention of the cigarette leads to a basic boom in tobacco sales. Now, this boom in tobacco sales is kind of going back to a time when cotton was not as important. Remember, prior to cotton really becoming important around 1800 or the late 1790s, tobacco had been the primary crop. that was grown, along with rice and indigo and other things, in the South. In the late 1800s, with the, I shouldn't say the decline of cotton, but the reduced emphasis on cotton, tobacco once again becomes prominent, especially with the invention of the cigarette. Now, the guy who took the best advantage of that was a guy named James B. Duke. And James Duke had formed a tobacco monopoly in the South called the American Tobacco Company. And this is a date I want you to jot down, in 1890. So while Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan were all building their industries in the North, there was one guy in the South who had developed a tobacco monopoly in 1890, right around the same time as these other guys. Now, Duke became a bit of a philanthropist, and he decided in his hometown of Durham, North Carolina, there was a local college that he wanted to donate money to. Now, that college at that time was known as Trinity College in Durham, North Carolina. If you know anything about this, though, you'll recognize these spires in the background, because today they are the most famous landmark not of Trinity College, as it was known back then, but of Duke University today. That's right. If you're a college basketball fan at all, you, of course, know Duke University. And it was renamed after the Duke family. It used to be called Trinity College. Renamed after the Duke family because of the major funds that they had donated to Trinity College. Because of this, once again, it's known as Duke University today, even with their Cameron crazies and everything like that. It's supposed to be a really good school full of very smart people. Now, there was one other industrial aspect that people don't always recognize. It's kind of a not really well-examined part of American history. But while Pittsburgh was known as the steel capital of America in the Rust Belt of the North, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, thanks to Andrew Carnegie, the South had one area with a lot of iron ore deposits, and there was basically a blossoming steel industry there that is still continuing today. It's Birmingham, Alabama. They had, high steel production due to the iron ore and coal deposits that were around it, and because of that, even still today, Birmingham is known as the Pittsburgh of the South, Birmingham, Alabama. And every year, the annual football game, rivalry game between the University of Alabama Crimson Tide and the Auburn Tigers is still known as the Iron Bowl. And that's in part kind of a nod to the steel industry that existed and developed in Birmingham, Alabama during this time. The only other real method or real move toward industry in the South had to do with the cotton itself. A lot of people from the North, northern capitalists, brought their money to the South to move cotton factories down there. Now, cotton used to be harvested in the South, and then it was shipped to factories in the North to be processed and turned into textiles and whatever the case may be. But a lot of northern capitalists came down south after the Civil War and started to see the benefits of just putting their factories right down there. It wasn't a huge movement, but it was significant enough that it needs to be recognized. So, all in all, when it's all said and done, what is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution in the South? Well, again, not a huge influence, but when you take a look, it still left a lot of people in the fields, harvesting cotton and things like that. But when it's all said and done, after King Cotton declines a little bit, we do start to see a monopoly in the South with the tobacco industry through James B. Duke. We do start to see the Pittsburgh of the South develop at Birmingham, Alabama, and we do start to see some textile factories popping up to help out with the cotton production that is still very necessary, not just for America, but for the world. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for listening.